Pasts remembered, pasts forgotten. Thus it was they journeyed homeward. Thus it was that Hiawatha, to the lodge of Nokomis, brought the moonlight, starlight, firelight, brought the sunshine of his people, Minnehaha, laughing water, handsomest of all the women in the land of the Dakotas, in the land of handsome women. That's an excerpt from Song of Hiawatha, written in 1855 by Henry Wadsworth.
I think it might be
Longfellow.
Wadsworth actually.
Yeah, I was doing really well with my NPR classical station voice until I
Yeah.
got to Wadsworth, and then that made me giggle. But that is a piece written by Wadsworth Longfellow, that it went on to become the encapsulation of a lot of the romanticized version of history of Minnesota's identity, and especially of depictions of the indigenous Minnesotans. I'm Sam Temple with my producing partner Logan Ledman. I've been going through the book North Country by Mary Lethert Wingard. It's a fantastic book about the history of Minnesota, the founding of Minnesota. And we are now at the epilogue
Mm-hmm.
titled Pasts Remembered, Pasts Forgotten. Logan, the story of the book really wrapped up in the last chapter. So, like an epilogue, this gives us some tidbits, some details, but the real meat of the story is past us. This is essentially bringing us to the present day, bringing us to how we view this history now.
Yeah, it's a reflection on not just how we think about 1862 today, but also how 1862 was remembered in the decades immediately afterwards, leading up to the middle part of the 20th century.
Hmm.
And Mary Lethert Wingard starts with the great example of the remains of Tauyate Duta as sort of a symbol of how this history was treated. The story runs throughout the epilogue of how, we talked about Tauyate Duta's death last episode, and his body was taken. He was brought into town, and it was mutilated after his death in July of 1863, and his body eventually ended up, here and there, and the scalp ended up in the hands of the adjutant general, I believe, of the young state of Minnesota. And eventually he got sick of holding on to it after a couple years, and he tossed it in the trash. But a janitor noticed it in this guy's trash, pulled Tauyate Duta's scalp out of the trash, and sent it into the Minnesota Historical Society, where it was held on display until 1915, when Tauyate Duta's grandson saw it at the Minnesota Historical Society and very understandably asked it to be removed from exhibition. And so rather than it being buried, though, it was put in the archives of the Historical Society, hidden away. And it wasn't until, I think, 1971,
Hmm.
that Tauyate Duta's ancestors finally got to bury Little Crow's remains. And so that slow first, like, revelry in the violence, and then a hiding away of the memories of the war, and then indigenous reclaiming of the war, is sort of
Right.
the backdrop of the last 150 years of historical
Right.
memory of the U.S. Dakota War. And Winger does a great
Yeah.
job of summing it up with the story of Tauyate Duta's remains.
Yeah, yeah. Historiography is a very interesting study, independent of, history itself, rather than the studying of the facts, the studying of how the narratives have changed, the studying of how the facts themselves and how they are framed has changed. And Wingard talks about not just the U.S. Dakota War, but also the Civil War, which I found really interesting,
Yeah.
because we've talked a lot, as a society, about how the Civil War has been romanticized over the years, from this really awful, bloody, ideological conflict to then it was, in the 1920s, and specifically Wingard points out it wasn't until the 1880s when the Civil War started to be romanticized, and you started to have more veterans getting back together from the North and the South. It became sort of a curiosity to reconsider the Civil War and make it this fantasy, pretty much. And that also began to happen not just with the U.S. Dakota War, but with Minnesota history in general and the relationship that the state of Minnesota had with the indigenous people and how the relationship that white Minnesotans had with indigenous people. So Longfellow's Song of Hiawatha was used as that piece. It was already sort of a romantic, um, nostalgic poem, even when it was written in 1855. Um, and in the decades later, it became part of the zeitgeist, part of, oh, this is something from the time, and this really tells how it was, and it simply wasn't. But that is the history that generations began to be told, um, and even to this day, history classes and public perception fail to realize that indigenous people are still alive. They are still around. They are still members of our community, members of our society, and they live on their homelands when they are fortunate enough to be granted permission to live there after it was taken away. Um, and Wingard writes, uh, the Dakota conflict, 1862, was the last act in a cultural transformation that divided the history of quote unquote modern Minnesota from that of the multicultural borderland that had existed for the previous 200 years. And earlier on the page, he says, um, it was that very distance from the tragic summer of 1862 that made Indian bones seem as appropriate for a museum display as mastodon tusks or shards of prehistoric pottery. And that's really how indigenous Minnesotans were viewed for a very long time, and by many are still viewed by Minnesotans, much of the United States, and much of the colonized world. Um,
Yeah,
and
David
yeah, yeah,
Truer is a he's a novelist and historian, and he is a member of the Ojibwe tribe, and his book, "The Heartbeat of Wounded Knee," is
mm-hmm,
essentially that idea. It came out a few years ago, and it's the idea that I think you and I grew up in a time when this idea was still relatively common, that Indian history was the story of an extinct people who are gone. And when we learned about indigenous history through a like progressive or liberal lens, it was that it was a sad story. It was really sad that indigenous
mm-hmm,
people were extinct, but that was still the story. Was that it was an inevitability, and that it happened, that they were replaced fully by a superior in some way civilization. Um, and the pushback against that has started, as Wingard writes, in the 60s and 70s, and has continued to this day to really emphasize the point that the Dakota and Ojibwe people of Minnesota are still very much around. Whether they're in exile in
mm-hmm.
Canada still, as several tribes are, or they're in Minnesota or in South Dakota. They still exist, and not only exist,
Mm-hmm.
but are struggling to rectify the consequences of these historical moments a century and a half later, or just
Right.
simply attempting, as everyone does, to hold on to what matters to them, and live lives of full meaning.
That's right. Really, truly, this is it's not hyperbole to say that indigenous rebellion, indigenous protesting, indigenous advocacy is as old as Minnesota itself, and I would argue that if it's not exactly as strong as it always has been, it might even be stronger now than at any point in recent history. And
I think in our
the
lifetimes, yeah.
the yeah the historiography um, has always had the option and the opportunity to include indigenous voices because they have been speaking out in Minnesota for as long as there has been uh, a conflict about that historiography. Um, and um, it's not until depressingly recently that those voices have been taken into account. Um, and that's an ongoing narrative. That's an ongoing shift. We're seeing this narrative change happen before our very eyes, and it's really fascinating to be a witness and even to some small extent at least contribute to the record of where we are in the year 2021. You know, um, but it wasn't always that way. For a long time after the U.S. Dakota War, Minnesota really wanted to bury it because Minnesota did not want to be seen as an unsafe place. They did not want to be seen as a frontier place. You know, California was the frontier. They wanted Minnesota to be part of the more, closer to the east than the Midwest or the West. They wanted to be a fully ingrained part of the Union, and so part
Yeah,
of
but
that was
by the 60s and
right.
70s, the railroads have been laid. Minnesota's
Mm-hmm.
industrializing. You'll talk about this, but tens of thousands of immigrants are coming in. So
Right.
the culture and economy of the state is completely transformed, and they want to leave that frontier narrative behind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But before that can fully, there's a last gasp of people trying to make money off of that image of the horrific dangers. We see this with some cable news stations, with some tabloids. If there's tragedy and there are bad things happen, people will want to exploit that for their own money. And I don't know if you'll remember this character, Logan, but Wingard writes, literary entrepreneur Harriet Bishop,
Yes.
recently divorced and fallen on hard times, was among the first to rush into print with Dakota War Whoop, published in 1863. The author of previous paeans of boosterism, Bishop did Minnesota no favors with her luridly embellished tale of rape and pillage by Indian fiends incarnate. End quote. So there was this last gasp of people making money off of it, and we talked a little bit in the last episode, and Wingard wrote about it, how in Mankato there were portraits of the hangings. There were spoons with engravings of the hanging depiction on it. There were beer bottles and all this stuff that was commemorating and promoting this historic event that was pretty much instantly romanticized. And you even heard that from Stephen Riggs, making it a balance of souls taken. Um, but very quickly after, especially after Sibley's expeditions into the Dakotas and the massacres that ensued there, Minnesota wanted to move on from that image. And largely they were able to do that because more and more people were coming into the land that weren't there during 1862. By 1880, I believe,
Hmm.
by 1880, roughly 30% of the population of Minnesota was foreign born. Even more telling, 71% of Minnesotans were either first or second generation immigrants. The old stock of citizens who had worked so hard to impose their cultural imprint on the infant state and attain recognition as a full fledged part of the nation had no sooner rid themselves of the Indians than they began to feel overwhelmed by hordes of foreign speaking Germans and Scandinavians. And end quote there from Wingard on page 356. Um, that really changes things. And about that time in 1880 is when they start to romanticize the Civil War as well.
Hmm.
And a lot of the people romanticizing it weren't there to experience it or weren't especially involved in it, and so fell prey to the revisionist history that was taking place in the 1880s. And that revisionist history bleeds into the further revisionism of the early 1910s, the 1920s. The Woodrow Wilsons of the world are coming into play. And that really leads us into the curriculum that bled into what you and I learned about in school, Logan.
Yeah. Yes. Very well said. the the really interesting interplay between choosing actively to play up the Civil War, to acclimate immigrants to nationhood, and wiping away memories of the U.S. Dakota War in order to forget the frontier image is really interesting because, uh, as you'll remember, this drive to sanitize the reality of Minnesota was one of the driving causes of the War of 1862 in the first place, in that
Mm-hmm.
it was a massively important part of advertising, was saying that there was nothing to be worried about. Everything was totally peaceful. There was no reason to think that the Dakota people might rebel against the oppressive conditions they're being forced into, um,
Mm-hmm.
and luring in hundreds, thousands of immigrants into the powder keg of the western frontier led directly to the
Mm-hmm.
U.S. Dakota War, and that same drive then continues to erase the reality of the U.S. Dakota War after causing it. Just a really fascinating
Mm-hmm.
kind of power that
Right.
that drive has.
Right. And the same revisionism that took place with the U.S. Dakota War and the Civil War also took place with slavery, also took place with imperialism, also took place with a lot of the things that the U.S. would rather not brand itself as it leads into the um, 20th century. Okay, well, I guess the imperialism they might have still wanted to brand themselves as, because that made them, a big kid at the table. Um, but later on, that was part of the revisionism.
Yeah, one thing I
But
want to
certainly
say,
slavery.
yeah,
Yeah.
and it one of the important points Wingard makes is transitioning from it being erased to it being mythologized. So when it's
Yes.
convenient to mythologize the Civil War in the influx of immigration in the 1880s and 90s into the early 20th century, the Civil War is mythologized and the U.S. Dakota War is forgotten. But later on in the 20th century, um, there's only so much hiding you can do, as Winger points out. Dakota and
Buffalo
Ojibwe.
Bill is super popular. Oh,
Yeah.
sorry.
No, yeah, yeah.
I interrupted you with.
No, it's
Uh,
okay. Yeah, you're right.
yeah.
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 But
The Wild West shows are popular.
yeah,
Annie
yeah.
Oakley's popular. This is making money. Again, there's this motive. Harriet Bishop in 1863, the graves weren't cold yet on U.S. settlers, and there's money to be made. So you write about it and you heighten the circumstances. You make it as horrifying as possible. Um, but then that stopped making money, so they erased it. Once it came back and they were able to make money off of it again, then you romanticize it and make this mythologized history.
Yeah. So uh, Minnesota is, well, it's a Dakota word, and there are Dakota and Ojibwe names for places and towns all over the state. So there's only so much hiding you can actually do, and in addition to the fact that, like you just mentioned, an undercurrent of popular demand for Wild West style stories and tales about Indian savagery fed into certainly keeping the memory alive, even if it wasn't part of the popular narrative about what made Minnesota Minnesota. And so by the 1930s into the 50s, Winger talks about that Indian heritage being turned into essentially a tourist device for the state, centering Minneapolis around uh, the Minnehaha Falls and the idea of
Mm-hmm.
Hiawatha, and
Mm-hmm.
Wadsworth Longfellow's poetry about the beauty of former Minnesota territory. And
Mm-hmm.
it's best typified in Wingard's writing by the creation of Little Crow Country Club in 2009, which
Mm-hmm.
is so perfectly horrifying, really, of
Mm-hmm.
taking the memory of this defining moment in Minnesota history, and it gets kind of conveniently buried for a century, and
Mm-hmm.
then it is dug back up to become a cute, like, cartoon symbol
Mm-hmm.
of a pretty past that
Right.
gives a sort of exoticism to the hegemony of the
Right.
industrial society of the 20th and 21st centuries.
Right. It fetishizes
Yeah,
indigenous culture and Dakota culture. There's we those kind of plastic scrapers that you use on dishes.
yeah,
They're just kind of these little squares or rectangles, and you just use it to get the crusty stuff off of the bottom of a pan or something. We've got one in my kitchen that is one of those little things that you get handed out if you go to a resort or in a gift bag or something. Little Crow Resort.
mm,
Um, and so this name, this title that has been passed down for generations in Dakota culture is now sudsed up and used to clean the burnt ends off of our cast iron pans. And there are little bits and pieces. There are road signs. There are trinkets all across the country like that.
yeah, and
And what people choose to romanticize is not this is actually the homeland of the Dakota people. This is not. It's not saying this is the history of Little Crow, and we're naming it
right,
after this so we can learn the history of Little Crow.
right,
It is instead of in the late 1800s, instead of romanticizing the multicultural world that actually existed in Minnesota, they had to build something else. They had to tell the story of the noble savage. They had to tell the story of the sad Indian that was just destined to go extinct. Because if they told the story of this multicultural coexistence, that begs the question, what happened? And since there isn't a good answer to that, instead you have to make something up. And that's what they did.
yeah. And I want to confirm for you. I just Googled it, and Little Crow Resort it's the same organization as Little Crow Country Club. It is
Oh, okay. Well,
yeah,
at least they're consistent with branding.
yeah.
So,
So it looks like they renamed to a resort at some point between 2011 and now, because they are
right.
now
So
a
there's some yeah.
they're a golf course, an event center, a restaurant, and a hotel now.
They've expanded.
Yeah,
All right.
so good
Well,
for them.
I don't want to say good for them. Um, so that's a thing. That's a thing, I guess.
Yeah.
That's a thing that has happened. I quote Wingard on page 358. The 200 years of mingled Indian and European American history that had gone before dissolved into a fanciful past, where jolly voyageurs and noble but doomed savages paddled the rivers in birch bark canoes and tracked the beaver to its lodge, the stuff of summer camp adventures and bedtime tales. And so, for much of the 20th century, myth rather than history shaped what most Minnesotans knew about the place of the Indians in the state's past. Vague, romantic, or cartoonish images concocted from the thin gruel of popular culture, school mascots, community pageants, and ubiquitous logos for Minnesota-made products. At mid-century, an official statewide celebration marked Minnesota's territorial centennial. It was an opportunity to recall an era when fewer than 5,000 Euro-Americans made their home on the edge of what was then nearly all Indian country. Uh, I haven't said this word out loud before. Propitious? Propitious?
Propitious.
Propitious. That's fun. A propitious moment to reflect on the world that had existed then. Instead, centennial events focused firmly on what was to come, celebrating with special pride the Treaty of Traverse des Sioux that opened the Sioux land to settlement by the legions of settlers whose industry and courage made Minnesota, quote, the prosperous state it is today. Huh? Yeah.
Yeah, I actually I was just reminded there by Sam and I several years ago came across a pageant put together for the small city of Northfield in the 1950s.
Oh
I believe
no.
1954 and 1955, and that was
You know,
a celebration of the centennial of Northfield, and that's exactly what Wingard is
I
talking about. That there's a whole scene in that pageant that was
I
put on in the town center, or Dover by St. Olafur Carleton, one of the community gathering places, in which there was a whole scene about one of the local Indian princesses, of whom there never was an Indian princess in southeastern Minnesota, nor I think anywhere. I don't think princess was a term that any tribe would have identified with. Um, but most importantly, it's just an example of how this mythology about the past, that the noble Dakota princesses used to live here, and they happily jogged out of the way for the good settlers. It's literally it's in our state seal. If you look at the
Right.
state seal of Minnesota, it's a happy farmer moving his plow across the ground as an Indian on a horse rides off into the west, and the sun sets. So it's everywhere, and I just remembered that pageant that we saw.
You're gonna regret bringing. I forgot that existed,
Uh-huh.
and now that I remember, Logan, do you know what we're gonna do next week on the
Oh
podcast?
God, are we gonna look at it?
I think we're gonna look at it. We're gonna have to read
Oh
excerpts.
God.
And unfortunately, then there will be audio recordings of us reading some of that stuff out loud. Um, and it's just it's crazy. I
It's
also
also very funny. It's a very funny
right.
pageant.
It's funny how it's ridiculous.
It's very
absolutely
ridiculous.
ridiculous.
Yeah, yeah. Anyways.
And part of why it's ridiculous is I don't know what production value they had for this mid-century community play.
Oh yeah.
But the scale of things that they talk about there, I don't know how they executed that.
Yeah.
Um,
We'll talk about that
but
if we read it next week. Yeah.
the imagination makes it quite something.
Yeah.
I was curious because we were talking about this. We were talking about the romanticized image about even that we had growing up. Logan, do you know what year the Disney film Pocahontas came out?
Ooh. I have no clue.
Yeah,
Maybe I don't know, 1989 maybe? Something like that.
1989. Okay, that's your guess. So for those of you who are either unaware or need a refresher, Pocahontas was a real person, but the story that the animated film tells is pretty much entirely fictional. And there are elements of it that do accurately portray indigenous culture, but most of it misses the mark largely because they decided to use the names of real people rather than just saying this is a made-up story.
Right.
I think it wouldn't have been as controversial as it was if they just said this is a made-up story.
Sure.
But because they tried to frame it in history, it just is wrong.
Yeah.
And so then that makes any mistake, they talk to indigenous people about making this film, but they just missed the mark in so many ways that could have been avoided if they weren't idiots about it. So there's the preamble on Pocahontas. Sounds like something. It came out in 1995, which isn't long enough ago to be doing that. It's really not. And it's
Well, I think it's worth saying though too that in our lifetimes there Sam and I were both born in 2001. So we've just over the course of the 21st century has been our lifetime so far, and across our lifetime there has been pretty explicitly, I think, a rebirth in indigenous activism and kind of a reclaiming of strength, because there was the American Indian movement was born in the 60s and 70s and had some really
in Minnesota.
Yeah, yeah, that's right, in Minnesota, and had some really extraordinary successes and nationwide attention, and it was cracked down on, and people like Leonard Peltier are still in prison because of their involvement with the American Indian movement, and so over probably into the 80s and 90s, there was obviously still indigenous activism, but sort of reeling from the backlash against the civil rights movement and the American Indian movement. Uh, it was kind of, it was buried a little bit. And then there was, in the 90s, there was the sense that, it was the end of history and there were no problems. Society was focused on the birth of computers and the prosperity of the 90s and all that. And then in our lifetimes, me and Sam, especially over the last decade, I'm thinking about the protests at Standing Rock, for example, as being kind of the first big event I remember that fed into Black Lives Matter and was impacted by Black Lives Matter and influenced Black Lives Matter, and was kind of part of that strain of activism, and that has grown over the course of our lifetimes. It was not. It had decreased over, say, my mother's lifetime. She was born in 71, and that strain.
You're not allowed to say Logan. Gary Ledman.
Right.
You're not allowed to say what year your mother was born. You're such an idiot.
All right. It's
okay. I was gonna say. I don't know what's gonna be more controversial. You bringing up Black Lives Matter or me bringing up the Pocahontas movie, but no. If we're gonna get comments on this episode at all, it's gonna be berating you for bringing up your mother's age.
She's proud of her age. There's no.
Then she can bring it up, Logan.
I am.
Gina, I am your better son. I am the favorite son of between Logan and myself.
I wouldn't blame her for that. I am very sorry. Okay, all right. I've made my point. What else you want to talk about?
All of this feeds into each other, and I think what my big takeaway from Wingard's writing is nothing exists in a vacuum. One piece of Minnesota history cannot be separated from the other. The history of logging, the history of brewing, the history of trade and railroads and prosperity and where the border is, all of that cannot be separated from the story of the indigenous people of Minnesota. And because it's hard to talk about the history of the interaction between the state of Minnesota, the United States, and indigenous people, so often that part goes ignored. So often the contributions of indigenous people go ignored simply because it's too difficult to talk about the bad. It's too difficult to talk about genocide. And it should be difficult. I'm not saying that we should be flippant about it. I'm not saying that we should take any of this lightly. It's just that simply because a conversation is hard to have doesn't mean it's not worth having. In fact, it usually means you really should talk about it. And so often, we've talked about so many of the issues that this has really shaped a lot of how you and I view the world, Logan, and how you and I view history. We view that we can learn from the past, and that's not just, well, we open the storybook today and we learn about this and we get this lesson from this. Good night, everybody. We'll read another storybook tomorrow. You need to learn from everything, from all of these moments. And I think we've talked about educated masses. We talked about historical literacy among everyday people. And it's very easy to see why history has become a luxury. If you are working very hard, if you're working 40 or more hours a week, history can feel very distant and very unnecessary. If you are in high school and you know that math and science and English, like those are really the math and English are the top ones that you need to get into a good school, and you're working on that. History, again, is incidental to most of the priorities that school systems, that standardized tests, that jobs tend to care about. history in the modern day has largely become a luxury, a source of entertainment and escapism rather than a tool for navigating the world. And I think where you and I see eye to eye on this, Logan, is that I history is our tool for navigating modern issues. It's our tool for navigating politics. It's our tool for navigating life decisions, is understanding the history of people who have come before us, the pitfalls, the triumphs of people that have come before us, the broader sociological movements. History is an incredibly powerful tool, and so often today it's used as primarily, a Facebook post, primarily as, well, we don't need to discuss this because we don't understand our history, or we don't need to do this because we don't understand this piece of history, or this is really more complex than you think it is. And history has been weaponized for all of the wrong reasons. I think rather than history being a weapon to say, you're wrong about this, and here's my historical evidence to back it up. You're wrong about this, here's my historical evidence to back it up. If more people used history as their guide for making decisions and understanding the world, you'd understand how no issue lives in a vacuum. You'd understand that there is complexity, there's interaction between all forms of life, there's interaction between water and the land management, and how good your child's education might be, and how close to the capital you are. If you understand history, you might understand why some parts of the United States have more health issues, have more cancer situations, have the industry that they have, which might be negatively or positively affecting how different communities thrive and how different communities suffer. And if you yourself are trying to make a decision about where to live, about who to vote for, about how to feel about your neighbor who is saying some extreme things, or even navigating things online. Wingard has a master class on being skeptical of, okay, this information is presented to us, someone has made this historical claim, here are these different pieces of evidence that I can say to dispute it, here are these different pieces that evidence of support this, and here's what I believe, there are these weaknesses and these strengths in my takeaway from this. It's a master class in even just consuming media, in taking things at their face value. So again, having a more historically literate population might even help you navigate social media. So this has been, a long rant on my part, but really my takeaway and my massive, massive appreciation for Mary Lethbridge Wingard is that her writing has me feeling all of these things. And despite this being, a 300-page book, and we just got through it, and it's very emotionally taxing, especially once you get toward the end of it. It gets more difficult to read the further it goes on, simply because it's hard to read about. It only makes me appreciate history more, and appreciate even more the tool it has been for our lives. Period.
Well said. As we wrap up, then I want to say that one group of people right now who I know for whom history does not feel distant is the people protesting against Line 3 running through Ojibwe and Anishinaabe lands. It is such a very explicit example of how these questions about land usage, about
honoring treaties,
about
input,
about indigenous sovereignty, and about the existence of Ojibwe and Dakota people are still central to Minnesota today, and like Sam said, everything is tied into each other. So the protests against Line 3 are not just about indigenous rights, not just about the rights of the Ojibwe people to not have their rightful lands desecrated. It's also about climate change. It's also about the protection
sexual
yeah
exploitation of indigenous women, which
was
is
also part of the story of the 1850s and 60s. Like none of yes, it's very true that for a lot of people, and especially for a lot of white people, um,
mhm,
it is easy for history to be, you watch the History Channel, you pick up a couple books every couple years and read about Abraham Lincoln or George
mhm,
Washington. You go on a couple tourist trips to Colonial Williamsburg or maybe a battlefield or something,
mhm,
and you check out your local museum. And that's what history is. It is a part of a vacation. It is it's a curiosity and a hobby or an
mhm,
interest. But for many people, it is the fabric of their lives and um, undisputably connected to the struggles that they face today. And I think that's history is more indisputably connected to the struggles that a lot of white people face than we realize too.
right.
And we can kind of get caught up into the cultural processes that hide that from us. But it is surprisingly easy when you attempt to understand history, um, to kind of tear your way out of that veil and understand um, that it is all connected and that it is imperative to understand our history, because it is still so very important.
Mhm. That that really, what I really was moved by in this book is there's nothing inevitable
Mm-hmm.
about history. Things did not need to go this way. We are still in control of the narrative. Even if it feels like there's an immovable presence, even if it feels like it's impossible to get this river off course, history is not inevitable. And that in turn means our futures are not inevitable. The Dakota people did not go extinct. It wasn't inevitable that there was going to be conflict with white Minnesotans. Um, and in fact, for me, history is a source of hope.
Mm-hmm.
Multiculturalism thrived in Minnesota, not devoid of conflict, but they were human beings living alongside each other, relying on each other, and it worked. It was broken, it was torn apart, but if you use history to say that conflict is inevitable and there's always been these ingrained problems, you're missing the interconnectedness. You're missing the part of the story where that wasn't what was happening. And for me, then history, as infuriating as it is, as powerless as it can make you feel, it can also be incredibly empowering that change can be made. There is a better possibility, there is a better route. And we know because it has happened. And we know because there have been attempts. We know that there have been smaller versions of it happening in other places around the world and in Minnesota. History can be a tool for empathy, it can be a tool for furthering education, but it can also be a tool for hope. And ultimately, I think that's the takeaway that we need. Because going off of these last few chapters is easy to simply be in despair. It's simply to just be demoralized. But history ultimately, to me, shows how many individual opportunities we have for change, how many opportunities personally, how many opportunities as a society, as a collective, do we have to change? And the history of Minnesota shows that it was never just one decision. It was never just a single decision that decided the course of Minnesota history. It was a lot of small decisions. So today, if we're looking at shaping our future and our future history, it doesn't always have to be the big decisions. Sometimes it's just the small decisions that can change the course of how we live, how we view and participate in life in the North Country. It has been a pleasure to go through this book with you, Logan. I really thought when we were going to hit record today that it was going to be maybe 20 minutes. We'll talk about the epilogue. We'll do some takeaways. I'm kind of tired right now. I don't know if I'll get that fired up. Well, you got me talking about Pocahontas. So it was a pleasure to go through this book with you, Logan. I hope our viewers enjoyed it, and maybe they did until this episode. But we'll see. We'll see. Next week, Logan, I look forward to going through that bizarre Northfield pageant with you.
Yes.
Great. That's what we'll end it on. You going, yes.
Perfect.